Chapter 1. The Hidden Door. The old estate of Blackwood Manor had always held an air of mystery, but none of its secrets intrigued young Evelyn more than the attic. Ever since she was a child, she had heard strange noises from above, soft creaks in the dead of night, whispers that seemed to come from the rafters, and an odd tapping sound like fingernails on wood. Her parents dismissed her concerns, calling it nothing more than the sounds of an aging house. But Evelyn knew better. Something was up there. Now, at 21, she had finally returned to the manor after her grandfather's passing. The house, once lively, felt abandoned in his absence. Dust coated every surface, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. As she wandered through the dimly lit halls, her fingers trailing along the peeling wallpaper, her gaze drifted upward to the attic door at the end of the corridor. It had never been locked before. Now, a heavy iron latch secured it, its presence both foreign and foreboding. Evelyn felt an inexplicable pull toward it, an urge she couldn't shake. Her grandfather had never spoken of the attic, nor had she ever seen him go up there. But the sounds, those eerie sounds, had never stopped. That night, long after the house had settled into an uneasy silence, Evelyn returned to the attic door with a lantern in hand. The lock was rusted but sturdy, resisting her attempts to pry it open. Frustrated, she searched the study for anything that might help, and to her surprise, found an old iron key buried beneath a pile of forgotten papers. It was cold to the touch, as if it had not been held in years. With a deep breath, she returned to the attic and inserted the key. The lock clicked open with an unsettling ease, and the door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase leading into the darkness above. A musty, stagnant smell seeped out, the air thick with the weight of time. Evelyn hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn back, but curiosity, fierce and unrelenting, pushed her forward. As she ascended, the lantern's glow barely cut through the suffocating shadows. The attic was larger than she expected, filled with forgotten trunks, draped furniture, and stacks of yellowed books. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed by her presence. And then she saw it. A door. Small, almost hidden behind a towering bookcase. Its wood was darker than the rest, as if untouched by time. And unlike the attic's other furnishings, there was no dust upon it. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The hidden door. A sense of déjà vu washed over her. Had she seen this before? Dreamt of it? The whispers? Had they been calling her here all along? She stepped closer, heart pounding, reaching for the handle. But the moment her fingers brushed against the cold brass knob, the whispers returned. Louder this time. Urgent. Chapter 2. The Creaking Floorboards. The floorboards groaned under Evelyn's hesitant steps as she inched further into the attic. Each movement sent a slow, drawn-out creak through the space, the sound unnerving in the otherwise oppressive silence. The air was thick, laced with dust and the scent of aged wood, making every breath feel heavy in her chest. The lantern in her hand flickered, casting shifting shadows across the cluttered room. Trunks stacked haphazardly, old furniture draped in ghostly sheets, and books spilling from decaying shelves lined the attic's interior. But it was not the forgotten relics that unnerved her. It was the sound. A creak, soft but deliberate, echoed from the farthest corner of the attic. Evelyn froze. She wasn't alone. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythmic thudding drowning out the distant whispers that had begun again. They seemed to be moving, circling her, their unintelligible murmurs blending with the soft groans of the wooden floor. She tightened her grip on the lantern and took another step. Creak. The sound had shifted. It was coming from directly beneath her. Swallowing hard, Evelyn lowered the lantern toward the floorboards. The wood was old, weathered, but one particular plank caught her eye. Unlike the others, it looked slightly displaced, as if it had been lifted and hastily put back in place. The edges didn't quite align with the surrounding boards. Kneeling down, she traced her fingers along the seam. A chill ran through her as she felt the faintest draft seeping through the gap. Something was beneath the floorboards. With trembling hands, she wedged her fingers beneath the loose plank and pulled. The wood resisted for a moment before giving way with a dry, splintering sound. She coughed as dust billowed into the air, but her eyes remained locked on the dark, narrow space she had uncovered. Inside, wrapped in decayed fabric, was a small wooden box. Evelyn hesitated before reaching inside, her fingers brushing against the brittle cloth. It crumbled at her touch, revealing the box's surface beneath. A dark, polished wood, marred with deep scratches, as though someone had tried desperately to claw it open. She lifted it carefully, setting it onto her lap. The weight of it was heavier than she expected. Carved into the lid was an unfamiliar symbol etched deep into the wood. A strange unease settled over her, an instinctual warning whispering in the back of her mind. And then the floorboards behind her creaked. Not from her own movement, from something or someone else. The whispering grew louder. Chapter 3, Whispers in the Dark. The whispers surrounded Evelyn, rising in a soft chorus of murmurs that seemed to ebb and flow like a restless tide. The attic's air thickened, heavy with unseen presence, pressing against her skin like a cold shroud. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out her thoughts as she slowly turned, lantern trembling in her grasp. The wooden box in her lap felt suddenly heavier, as though whatever lay inside was aware of her discovery. The etched symbol on the lid seemed to glow faintly under the flickering light, an ominous pulse that sent a shiver racing down her spine. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "Who's there?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. The only response was the whispering. It wasn't random. It wasn't the wind. The voices were layered, distinct, though she couldn't understand the words. They spoke in hushed urgency, overlapping in a language that was both unfamiliar and unnervingly familiar. It felt as though they were speaking to one another. About her. Evelyn forced herself to her feet, her fingers tightening around the box. She turned toward the darkened corner of the attic where the whispers seemed strongest. The shadows there stretched impossibly long, twisting as though something lurked just beyond the veil of visibility. Her lantern's light flickered again, dimming for just a moment, and in that instant, she saw it. A figure. It was barely more than a silhouette, but Evelyn knew she wasn't imagining it. The shape was unmistakable. Small, hunched, and standing perfectly still. Her breath caught in her throat, the oppressive silence between the whispers unbearable. Then, in a voice barely more than a breath, it spoke. Evelyn stumbled back, her pulse roaring in her ears. The shadow didn't move, but the attic around her seemed to shift. The boxes, the furniture, the very walls. It was as if the space itself had warped around her discovery. The voices grew frantic, a chorus of warnings that sent a deep primal terror coursing through her. The shadow figure remained unmoving, but Evelyn knew, deep in her bones, that something had changed. She had been noticed. Chapter 4: The Vanishing Portrait. Evelyn barely had time to recover from the shadowy figure before her attention was drawn to something else entirely. Against the far attic wall, beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, stood an aged, gilded portrait. The moment she laid eyes on it, a cold, inexplicable sense of recognition coursed through her veins. The woman in the painting looked eerily familiar. With cautious steps, Evelyn approached, her lantern casting flickering light across the cracked oil paint. The portrait's subject bore an uncanny resemblance to her. Same deep-set eyes, same sharp features, though the woman's attire suggested a time long past. A Victorian-era gown draped over her form, elegant yet hauntingly solemn. But it wasn't just the resemblance that unsettled Evelyn. It was the expression on the woman's face. She wasn't merely staring outward. She was looking directly at Evelyn, studying her as if she knew her. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. How could this be? Who was she? And why had this portrait been abandoned up here? Forgotten. Her fingers hesitated before reaching out, dusting away a thick layer of grime on the golden frame. The nameplate below was barely legible, its letters worn away by time. She traced the indentations, trying to decipher the name. Eleanor Hartley. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Hartley. That was her mother's maiden name. Was this woman an ancestor? A distant relative? But why had no one ever spoken of her? Just as she was about to step back, the lantern flickered violently, and a gust of frigid air rushed through the attic, extinguishing the flame. Darkness swallowed the space. A slow, deliberate creak echoed through the attic. Evelyn's heart pounded as she fumbled for a match, hands trembling. The whispers started again, low and urgent. And when the lantern finally sparked back to life, the portrait was gone. Chapter 5: Secrets in the Dust. Evelyn stood motionless in the attic, her breath unsteady as she tried to process what had just happened. The portrait, gone, vanished as if it had never been there. The dust-covered floor where it had rested remained undisturbed, leaving no sign that it had ever existed. A chilling realization settled over her. she wasn't imagining this. The attic held secrets. Secrets buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten time. And she was now part of them. Swallowing hard, she turned her attention to the surrounding clutter. If the portrait had disappeared, perhaps there was something else hidden within these relics of the past. Something that could explain what was happening. She carefully stepped over broken floorboards and forgotten trunks, her lantern casting long shadows against the cobweb-covered beams. Her fingers trailed over a stack of old books, their spines brittle with age. Many were covered in dust, but one in particular stood out. Unlike the others, it had been disturbed recently. A smudged handprint marred the cover, as if someone had held it not too long ago. Evelyn brushed away the grime and read the faded title, Hartley Family Ledger. Her heart skipped a beat. The Hartley name again. Her mother's family name. Was this a record of her ancestors? Had her grandfather kept this hidden all these years? She carefully opened the book, the pages brittle beneath her touch. The ledger contained dates, names, and financial records, but as she flipped further, the entries became stranger. Notes scrawled in the margins detailed events that had little to do with accounting. July 12, 1893. The whispers have returned. The child speaks to them. September 4, 1893. Lock the door. It is not safe anymore. November 17, 1893. Eleanor is gone. The portrait remains. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read the final line. Eleanor, the name from the vanished portrait. Was she the child mentioned in the earlier entries? What had happened to her? A sudden gust of cold air swept through the attic, making the pages flutter wildly. Evelyn clutched the book tightly, her lantern's flame flickering against the unseen disturbance. And then she saw it. In the dust-covered mirror leaning against the far wall, a figure stood behind her. A child. Her reflection remained frozen in terror as the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the attic with an overwhelming chorus of voices from the past. And the dust beneath her feet began to shift. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Child. Evelyn's breath hitched as she turned to face the mirror, her hands trembling around the lantern. The reflection revealed a small child standing just behind her, barely visible in the dim, dust-filled attic. The girl's figure was pale, almost translucent, her delicate features framed by tangled curls. Her eyes, dark, hollow voids, locked onto Evelyn's with an eerie intensity. The whispers in the attic grew louder, wrapping around her like an invisible force. Evelyn couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air thickened, heavy with unseen presence. Who are you?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The child tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she moved forward. But in the mirror, Evelyn saw no movement behind her, only the girl's reflection drawing closer, her form flickering like a dying candle. Panic clawed at Evelyn's chest. She spun around, expecting to find the child right there, but the attic remained empty. Yet, in the mirror, the girl. "Help me," the child whispered, the sound slithering through the air like a plea carried by the wind. "Please." Evelyn swallowed hard, gripping the lantern tighter. "Help you how? Who are you?" The child's reflection flickered again. This time she lifted a tiny, trembling hand and pointed downward, toward the floorboards. Evelyn hesitated, her stomach knotting with dread. The attic was old, but the floor beneath her looked disturbed. The dust wasn't as thick there, the boards slightly uneven compared to the rest of the attic. A chill ran down her spine. The girl's reflection in the mirror darkened. "They buried me here." A sickening realization settled over Evelyn. She dropped to her knees, running her hands over the wooden planks. There, at the edge of the attic, near the forgotten furniture, one particular board felt loose. With shaking fingers, she wedged her nails beneath it and pulled. The wood came free with a brittle snap, and beneath it lay something wrapped in a disintegrating cloth. The fabric crumbled beneath her touch, revealing tiny bones. Fragile, dust-covered remains that had been hidden for decades. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her pulse roared in her ears as the lantern's glow illuminated the long-forgotten skeleton of a child. A low, sorrowful whisper filled the attic. "You found me." Chapter 7. The Lock Trunk. The discovery of the child's remains had shaken Evelyn to her core. The attic, once a place of whispers and mysteries, now felt suffocating, heavy with sorrow and secrets that had been buried for too long. But she knew she couldn't stop now. There was more to uncover, more that the shadows had yet to reveal. As she steadied herself, her eyes landed on an old trunk tucked away in the farthest corner of the attic, its heavy frame covered in thick dust. Unlike the other forgotten furniture and scattered belongings, this trunk was different. It was locked, and the lock itself, an iron clasp with the same unfamiliar symbol etched into it as the wooden box she had found earlier, sent a chill down her spine. Something was inside. Something that had been kept hidden for a reason. With trembling hands, she brushed away the dust, revealing more of the intricate carvings along its lid. The letters were faded, barely readable, but as she leaned in closer, she managed to decipher them. Eleanor Hartley? Her breath caught. The same name from the vanished portrait, the same name from the family ledger. The pieces were connecting, but the full picture remained elusive. Who was Eleanor Hartley, and why had her name been buried, both in history and in this attic? Evelyn's hands instinctively reached for the lock, but it was rusted shut, refusing to budge. Frustration mingled with anticipation. There had to be a key somewhere. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, her fingers traced the edges of the trunk, feeling for any hidden compartments. And there, just beneath the latch, she found it. A tiny, almost imperceptible notch. Digging her fingernail into the groove, she pried it open, revealing a small brass key nestled inside the compartment. Her heart pounded as she lifted it, the metal cold against her skin. With a deep breath, she inserted it into the lock and turned. The trunk creaked open with a groan, releasing a stale breath of air that carried the scent of old paper, aged wood, and something faintly metallic. Inside, neatly stacked, were bundles of letters wrapped in faded ribbons, their parchment yellowed with time. Evelyn picked up the topmost letter and carefully unfolded it, her eyes scanning the inked words. The handwriting was elegant, yet shaky, as if written by someone overcome with emotion. If you are reading this, then the whispers have found you too. Her hands trembled. Whoever had written this letter had known. They had known about the whispers, about the attic's secrets, about the ghost of the forgotten child. And as she continued reading, the shadows behind her began to move. Chapter 8. Shadows Behind the Rafters. Evelyn's breath came in short gasps as she clutched the aged letter, its inked words burning into her mind. The whispers had found her. But who had written this warning? And how had they known what she would discover in the attic? The trunk before her seemed to exhale a sigh of forgotten time, its contents untouched for decades. She carefully lifted another bundle of letters, feeling the weight of the past pressing against her fingertips. The attic around her remained silent, save for the faint flickering of her lantern's flame. But the presence of unseen eyes gnawed at her nerves. A sudden shift above her made her freeze. The rafters groaned, the old wooden beams stretching under a weight that shouldn't be there. The sound was distinct, not the moan of settling wood, but something else. Something moving. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the trunk. She slowly lifted her lantern toward the ceiling, her breath catching as the light illuminated the dust-laden beams. Shadows shifted. A figure hunched in the darkness between the rafters, its form barely visible within the gloom. The body was small, too small to be an adult. The limbs, thin and unnatural, were curled into a tight crouch, as though waiting for her. Evelyn couldn't breathe. The lantern's flame trembled, casting flickering patterns along the attic walls. The figure remained still, yet she could feel its gaze piercing through the shadows, locked onto her. The sensation sent a shiver through her bones. And then it moved. A low creak echoed as the figure uncurled, its limbs elongating as it began to shift forward. The whispering that had once been distant grew sharper, filling the attic with voices, pleading, crying, warning. Leave. The words slithered through the air, not spoken aloud but inside her mind, pressing against her skull like an unbearable weight. The figure dropped lower from the rafters, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Fine, Eleanor," it murmured, the name barely more than a breath. Evelyn stumbled backward, the letter slipping from her grasp. The lantern wavered as her pulse roared in her ears. The name. The one she had seen in the portrait, the ledger, the trunk, was now whispered by a thing that should not exist. The attic walls seemed to close in around her. The whispers surged into a chorus, an urgent warning she was too terrified to heed. The figure above her moved again, This time, it descended. Chapter 9. The Voice That Calls. The attic was no longer silent. The whispers had turned into a steady hum, a chorus of voices layered atop one another, each speaking words Evelyn could not fully grasp. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound only grew louder, vibrating through her bones, filling her with a fear deeper than anything she had ever known. And then, amid the chaos, a single voice broke through. Evelyn, her name, spoken clearly, urgently, as if it had been calling her for years, waiting for her to finally hear. She turned sharply, her lantern trembling in her grasp. The figure from the rafters was gone. The attic stretched before her, its shadows deep and shifting, refusing to let her go. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs as she scanned the space, but there was no movement, only the echo of that voice lingering in the air. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. A pause. Then, again the voice called to her. Evelyn. This time she followed it. She stepped cautiously through the attic, weaving between the forgotten trunks and dust-covered furniture, the glow of her lantern casting fleeting light on the ancient wooden beams. Every step felt heavier, as if the house itself was reluctant to let her move forward. The voice guided her, not in words, but in presence, in a pull that she could feel deep within her chest. It led her to the farthest corner of the attic, and there, beneath the rotted remains of an old rug, she saw it. Another door, smaller than the others, barely noticeable, but it was there. Her breath hitched. She knelt down, brushing away the dust with trembling fingers. Unlike the attic's other doors, this one had no handle, only a narrow gap where the wood met the floor. It looked as though it had been sealed long ago, forgotten by time. The whispers around her rose to a fevered pitch, swirling like a storm inside the attic walls. The air turned frigid. Evelyn clenched her fists, fighting the urge to flee. Something was behind that door. Something had been waiting for her to find it. The voice called again, closer now. "Evelyn, please." She recognized it this time. Eleanor Hartley, the woman in the portrait. The name in the ledger. The ghost that had followed her through the shadows. Evelyn knew, with an unsettling certainty, that if she opened this door, if she uncovered what lay beyond it, there would be no turning back, but she reached for it anyway. Chapter 10. The Final Revelation. Evelyn's fingers trembled as they brushed against the sealed wooden door. A chill seeped through the cracks, colder than anything she had felt before. The whispers surged around her, their voices overlapping, frantic and desperate. Some pleaded for her to stop, while others urged her forward, their eerie chorus swelling into an overwhelming hum. With a deep breath, she pushed. The door groaned, resisting at first, as though whatever lay beyond it did not wish to be disturbed. But then, with a sharp snap, the wood splintered, and the door creaked open, revealing utter darkness. The lantern's flame flickered as she stepped inside, illuminating a hidden chamber untouched by time. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the scent of dust and decay. At the center of the room stood an ornate antique cradle, its wooden frame warped with age. The sight of it sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. And then she saw her, Eleanor Hartley, the woman from the portrait, the whispers, the past. She stood by the cradle, her form barely solid, a ghostly silhouette flickering between existence and nothingness. Her face was eerily calm, her hollow eyes locked onto Evelyn's with an expression that was neither hostile nor kind. "You came," Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying through the still air. "You followed the echoes." Evelyn swallowed hard. Who are you?" Eleanor tilted her head, her translucent fingers grazing the cradle's edge. "I am what remains, a memory, a curse, a soul left behind." Evelyn stepped closer, the weight of the attic pressing down on her. Why have you been calling me?" Eleanor's lips parted, but the words did not come immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to the cradle. "Because you are the last to carry our name, the last who can end what was begun." Evelyn's heart pounded. "And what?" Eleanor lifted a fragile hand, pointing to the cradle. Evelyn hesitated, then slowly leaned forward, peering inside. The moment she did, a breath caught in her throat. Inside the cradle lay a bundle of cloth, impossibly preserved, and beneath the folds, tiny, skeletal remains. Those of an infant. Horror twisted in Evelyn's stomach. She stumbled back, her breath shuddering. No, this can't be. I was betrayed," Eleanor whispered. "By my own blood, my child taken, buried beneath the attic, forgotten. The whispers, they are hers. She has waited, and now she must be freed." Evelyn's vision blurred. The ledger, the portrait, the bones beneath the floorboards. It all made sense now. This was the secret of Blackwood Manor. This was the curse that had seeped through its walls for generations. "What do I do?" Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. Eleanor looked at her, eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. "Give her a name, a grave, a place where she can rest." Ellen's hands shook as she knelt beside the cradle, her pulse hammering. "Eleanor? What was her name?" The ghost's form flickered, her expression softening. "Isabelle?" The name sent a tremor through the air. The whispers grew deafening, rising in a crescendo of anguish and relief. The attic walls trembled, the shadows recoiled, and then silence. Eleanor was gone. Evelyn clutched the bundle in her arms, a profound stillness settling over her. The weight of centuries lifted, and for the first time, Blackwood Manor breathed again. The echoes had finally faded.